This webinar is going to be specifically devoted to the distribution takeoff. We're going to go at least a little bit into all 6 modules, the switchboards and panels, motor control centers, transformers, safety switches, starters, and user-defined equipment. So we're going to take a look at each of the modules, a couple of them in more depth than the others. I will pause at various times during the webinar, like Erica said, to ask for questions, and then we'll also we should have some time at the end to handle questions at that point. So I think we'll get started here. So switchboards and panels. This is probably the main module in the distribution takeoff group. So over here on the left here, you'll see this heading that says distribution takeoff. And the first module is switchboards and panels. Actually, let me flip back to the outline for just a minute. I want to discuss a couple of the terms here we use in this whole area of the takeoff that has mostly what we call quoted items. So we make the assumption when you take off a switchboard, a panel, a motor control center, a transformer, that those are items that you'll need to get a quote on. Now, there are some things in this part of the program, like the safety switches and the starters, that you have an option. And I'll show you how to activate which one you want, or to select whether you want to get a quote on the safety switch or starter, whether you want the program to price it. But for the most part, what we're dealing with here today are things that you'll need to get a quote on, just like fixtures, which if you've taken off fixtures before, you're familiar with that. At the end, it will ask you to put a quote in. It won't let you forget. Now, when you take off a switchboard or a panel, you have the option to put additional or other quoted items into that panel board or switchboard, things like circuit breakers and fusible switches, etc. And again, the program will assume that you're just going to get a quote on those, and it will plug in some labor for them. And then in all these modules, you also have the option to include additional items, things that you want the program to price. Maybe it's some Unistrut, maybe it's some additional accessories, things that you want the program to price, but not include what you send out for a quote on. So we'll cover that kind of subtlety here. That's kind of important as you go through the takeoff here. So I'm going to go into the distribution takeoff and open up switchboards and panels. Oops. Now this module requires a designation for every entry here. Same thing when we go to a couple of the other ones. Safety switches and starters do not require a designation. You can leave it open or plug in something if you like. So if you're taking off a panel board, a typical designation here would be P1. P1, L1, that kind of thing. On the next line down, and now keep in mind the main thing we're doing here is trying to give the program enough information to calculate the labor. So all these choices here have different labor issues, and when you pick one of these, it'll actually let you select things related to that. So when I go to a panel board, for example, it's going to let me choose surface or flush. It's going to let me choose the amperage. So obviously, the bigger the amperage, the more labor it puts in. Now, the number of sections on a panel board doesn't typically apply. You could have a 2-section panel board. That's a little bit unusual. Usually they just go to 82 circuits to make the panel board bigger, but the number of sections will normally apply to a switchboard. So we'll do that in a minute. Then you have the voltage. Now this doesn't affect the labor, and neither does whether it's single phase or 3-phase. But these all affect the item it selects in the database for the labor. Then you have an option here for the main type of main. So I'm going to go to circuit breaker, and then it automatically selects the same amperage here as it did on the panel itself. If you want a lower amperage, you can scroll up here and do that. Otherwise, it just defaults to 225. Now, this is an important option in switchgear that maybe a lot of people don't really understand why it's here. Factory assembled tells the program that you're anticipating or assuming that the panel board will come from the factory with the breakers installed. So anything you put under other quoted items is going to be calculated as far as labor differently, whether it's factory assembled or not. If it's not factory assembled, it puts more labor on for each circuit breaker that you put in, because it not only needs the labor to terminate the wire for the breakers, but it needs the labor to install the circuit breaker. So let's go ahead and put some circuit breakers in. So I'm going to go to single pole bolt-on, 20 amp, and we'll put in 20 of those. And then we'll do a 2-pole breaker, 30 amp, 2 of those. Now this information I just typically take straight from the panel schedule. And then a 3-pole breaker. Put in one of those. So every circuit breaker I add here is adding additional labor, but only for the wire terminations. If you had unchecked factory assembled, it would give you more labor. So I'm going to go ahead and hit F2 takeoff here. And it tells me how much labor is figured for that panel board based on all the selections I picked here. Now, if I want to see how much labor it would do without being factory assembled, you just uncheck it. And you can see the labor goes up a few hours. So I'm going to cancel one more time, do factory assembled again, and hit takeoff. So when you hit OK, it puts it down here in the bottom part of the screen. Now the copy feature works here if you didn't know, very similar to how it does in pictures. So if the next panel board is P2, you hit the down arrow and copy P1, and then you can just change whatever you want to change. Let's say I want to change the number of 20 amp breakers to 18. I want to delete this breaker. What you do is right click and hit delete. And then I'm going to add in another 3-pole breaker. So I'm going to hit select items, 3-pole bolt-on, 30 amp, and I'll put in 4 of those. So a lot of times you can save a few steps by copying something you've already input. Now there's also some pre-built assemblies. Let me touch on those for just a second. I'm going to take this off. It's a little more labor because it's another couple more circuit breakers. So there's some saved assemblies up here. If you just want a typical panel board or a typical load center, you can pick from this list. Let's just do something a little bit different. Let's do a 125 amp flush load center. So what that does is it brings in the circuit breakers automatically. It doesn't plug the quantities in. You can put in 12, 2. You can scroll down a little bit here. There's other breakers, one of these. And then you've got this field for notes here. Sometimes you might want to use this for the AIC rating. Any other notes that you think are pertinent. Now, my personal philosophy on taking off switchgear is that I'm not really focusing in on the specifications on the panel board unless I think it's going to affect the labor on the panel board. I expect the supplier will look at the panel schedule, they'll look at the specifications, probably look at the one-line drawing, and get any information from that. Now I'm going to do factory assembled again and hit takeoff. So we'll do one more example here. We'll do a main switchboard. Most places they would designate it something like MSB, some places it's MDP. And then on this line, I'm going to select the main switchboard. Again, your choices here, you can do multimeter boards like you might see in an apartment complex, panel boards, load centers, panel meter combos. You might see that in a commercial or residential situation where you get the meter as part of the panel board. I'm going to go to a main switchboard. We'll go up to 600 amp. Now the number of sections here, again, is the number of freestanding sections. For example, if this includes a CT section that's part of the switchboard, I would include that as one of the sections. We're going to put main circuit breaker again. We're going to leave it on factory assembled. Now these 2 check boxes, the meter and the underground pull section, don't affect the labor. They're just there for information. So if it's an underground service, we could check underground pull section. That way the supplier knows to quote it as an underground feed. Again, we're going to select items. We're going to go to 3-pole breakers. We'll go to 200 amp. We'll do 2 of those. We'll go back to 3-pole breakers, 100 amp, and we'll put in 2 of those. So again, when we hit takeoff, it tells us how much labor. So this is kind of unique in the whole program where it tells you how much labor it's calculating. I think we built that in many years ago because we just seemed to get a lot of we don't get a lot of consensus on labor for switchgear. Some people think it takes a lot more, some people think it takes a lot less, so we let you review that on the fly here and change it. You can also change it later, but it's one of those areas that it seems to be people disagree quite a bit. I find that switchgear really is something you want to have more cushion on than other parts of the job, because there's more handling involved as far as getting approval and submittals on the switchgear. It's a custom order item. You got to coordinate shipping, all kinds of things that don't necessarily come into play with other parts of the job like they would with switchgear. So in my mind, you want to have plenty of time here on the switchgear. Yeah, when you finish taking off the switchgear, there's an option here for a report up at the top right. Just hit OK here. So I would send this report off in a PDF format to the suppliers I want to quote. So it's going to have your company name and your phone number and the name of the job here. And then you could print this to a PDF or just use the save button to print it to a PDF. But again, I would send it along with the copy, the drawings, the pages that have the panel schedules, the one-line diagram, and any specifications they need. This at least makes sure we're on the same page. I wouldn't want to be quoting this job at bid time and find out they've missed a panel or find out they're quoting 2 panels that I didn't pick up. So it just puts us on the same page at a minimum. Okay, so let me stop for a second to see if anybody wants to ask any questions about the switchboards and panels. We've got about a dozen people in the webinar here today, so thanks for attending. Okay, now Motor Control Centers has a very similar format, just different parts that go into it, although the basic framework is kind of similar. You give it a designation. You tell it how many sections the motor control center has. Voltage, we'll do 3-phase, 4-wire, type of main, again, just like switchgear, or just like the switchboards and panels. And then we'll go with a 400 amp main. We'll tell it factory assembled. Now, if I had selected a main fusible switch, it would let me pick the size and type of fuses that go into it. And again, I might be putting some starters into the switchboard. If I come down here to reversible or non-reversible circuit breakers, and then we do the size. There's 4 of those. You could do them as, you can see, reversing or non-reversing. It can be fusible or circuit breakers. Maybe we put some push buttons in and just basically input all the components to go into the motor control center. Now, this is a quoted item, just like the switchgear. When I take it off, it's going to tell me how much labor. I can adjust it or leave it like it is. So now when I do that same report, it's going to have the motor control center on it. This is alphabetical, so you can see how that works. Any questions before we go to transformers? It's pretty straightforward. Once you understand the switchboard and panel takeoff, these 2 modules are pretty similar. Now, transformers is kind of a separate little area. Again, you give it a designation like T1, and then we're going to go to type. Maybe we've got a 75 kVA 3-phase transformer. Now, if you wanted some additional items, maybe I wanted to put like a trapeze hanger or some unistrut with it, I could hit select hanger, select items, go down here to miscellaneous items, and go to unistrut channel and fittings. Here's the channel. Let's say I want a couple of 4-foot pieces. And you could add other parts here too if you want some fittings and hardware and that kind of stuff. Spring nuts, it's all in here. We've added stainless steel unistrut to the database here a few months ago. So there's stainless steel strut and stainless steel fittings. But again, the difference here on the additional items is it doesn't include it on the information to be quoted, but the program does put price and labor in it. So we're going to put in one of these, and you'll see that in the audit trail here. So the transformer itself is listed as quote 2, but then the Unistrut I put in gets its own prices and labor units. So there's 8 feet of Unistrut and labor to cut it twice. Another thought on transformers is if you want to put in like a piece of flex, seal tight, or steel flex, you could put it under additional items. There's a category under assemblies for equipment connections. So you'll find NEMA 1 and NEMA 3 arm connections. I don't do that here. I go back to wire and conduit takeoff and do it under motor hookups. If you're feeding this transformer with flex and rather than conduit, these saved assemblies up at the top here are really good for transformers as well. You got a lot of sizes, and then you can build your own here. If you need 3-inch liquid tight flex, you just make the selections and fill it out. So you can do a lot more things here rather than having to use one of the existing assemblies or tweak one of them. You can build it here right here on the fly. Let's go back to distribution takeoff, transformers. So did we print that report again? I don't think so. That's going to add one more item to the report. It's going to be down at the bottom because we designated it T1. Right there. Now, safety switches is a little bit different because you have the option, as a matter of fact, unless you tell it otherwise, the program's going to put a price in for the safety switch. If you want it to be quoted, all you do is go over here to settings. So let's do it both ways. I'm going to do just and this option here is, the designation is optional. You don't have to fill it in. I can either go to saved assemblies, or if I want something that's not on that list, I can go to type. Come down here to 240 volt heavy duty NEMA 3R. And we'll make it a 60 amp 3-pole. And then for fuses, we'll put in 60 amp. So we'll say there's one of those. Again, if I wanted to go to additional items and pick up some motor connections, I could do that, or I could just flip back to the wire and conduit and go to motor hookups there, which is my preference, my recommendation. So let's say I've got a 200 amp switch on the one-line diagram that clearly should be quoted with the gear. What you can do is come over here to settings, change quoted, and safety switches quoted. Now, it's actually a little bit misleading that you could have switch gear that's not quoted because it assumes all that's going to be quoted unless you tell it otherwise. I mean, it's going to treat all the switch gear, the panels, the switchboards, motor control centers, transformers. Even though there's an option here to uncheck it, there's no price in the database. It's going to still default to a quoted item. But again, we're here to check safety switches quoted and fuses quoted. So this next entry, and until I change that setting, anything I enter in this part of the program in this module will be a quoted item. So we're going to go to type. Let's say it's 600 volt. It's a 200 amp. Again, the fuses will be quoted, but it does put labor in for them, so we want to do that. 200 amp fuses. And we'll say we've got one of these. So I'll do the report one more time. So that'll be down here under S1. There's the 200 amp switch and the fuses. So that's the little bit of a different option you have with safety switches, is they can be quoted or the program can price them. Now the same thing applies to starters, so maybe I won't go through an example of that. It's the very same thing. The program will put a price in unless you tell it otherwise, but if you change the setting to starters, Right now, they're not priced. If I check quoted, it would be a quoted item. Otherwise, the program will put a price in. Now, this other module is something that comes in handy sometimes if you run across some kind of equipment that you need a quote on, and you want it quoted with your gear, but it's not a something that you would normally find in the other modules. I'm just going to call it U1. So I'm going to put in a 400 amp. What's the word I'm looking for? Contact. Cabinet. So now I can go down here under items, and let's say the first thing I want is a big box, a big enclosure. Those would be under all items. So you hit the all items button here, come down here to miscellaneous items. We've added some bigger pull boxes here, so I'm going to go to screw cover. We'll go to NEMA 3R, 8, 10, and 12 inches deep. You can even do stainless steel. And we'll do a 36 by 36 by 10. So now I can add additional items if I need to put some, maybe a starter in there. That's not the kind I want the reversing. Put a couple of those in. And just keep building all the parts that you want to put into it. Now, again, you might want to have some mounting materials. Maybe I want some more Unistrut again. You just go under additional items, hit select items. Unistrut's under miscellaneous items. If you don't remember that, you can always search. I'm just going to search on the word strut. And here is supports and hangers, Unistrut, miscellaneous up here. There's the channel. I'll do a couple of 4-foot pieces again. And move on from there. You can even type in some text here if you just need to put information into the takeoff. Another field for notes. And we'll hit quantity and hit takeoff. We talk about the notes here, especially on the panel boards and switchgear and that kind of thing. Let's go back to this main switchboard here and hit edit to source. So you've got a place here to put notes in, but these notes don't go on the report that goes out to the supplier. If you put a note here, try to type a note, those notes appear on the report that goes out to the supplier. So these notes here just go to the audit trail. These notes here go on the report. So if it's something you want to appear on the report, then you put it under this blank line. There's 2 blank lines there up there. So I'm going to do the report one more time so you can see that. So now on that main switchboard, we've got that note here that it's 100K AIC. Let's talk about one more thing with switch gear or panel boards. It doesn't matter. I'm going to pull up one we've already taken off. Go to this panel P3. So typically we only put the breakers here that are going to be connected. If you want to put spare breakers in, you can do that. It gives them, I think, either no labor or very little labor. So if I go to 1-pole plug-in, I can add some 20 amp spares here. And that way they'll be on the report I send out. But again, I don't rely on the report so much as I do the copy of the drawings for the supplier to pick up things like spare breakers and all that. But you can put them in. If I go into select items, there'll be spare breakers in most of those categories. Okay, just one more topic here, so I'll pause one more time to see if there's any questions about what we've covered so far. I know it's quite a bit. So my last topic is other items in switchgear. And there's a couple things, a couple places that might come into play. Let's say you've got some, you want a meter or some other item like that. Doesn't matter what module you're in. There's always going to be miscellaneous takeoff up here at the right. Or you can come down here to the bottom and go to other takeoff and go to miscellaneous. And then most of what we're going to be looking for is under distribution equipment. So you'll see there's meters here. There's lots of individual other items related to distribution. So if I want a 400 amp meter or a 200 amp meter, here's a 3-phase 200 amp meter. You can see there's a CT there. And you could add to this list. If you're going to add items to the database or add a temporary item to a job and you want it to be quoted, this is what you do. You go to temp miscellaneous and you type in a description. Now we're in temporary here, so I'm not really worried about putting a good description here. A better example, I'm going to put in a widget. My go-to example here. Now, the phase is not critical, but I would put it under the rest of the switch gear here, which is right here. That way, when you extend it by phase, it'll come out with the panels and switchboards. More importantly, I want this to be a quoted item. So first you hit this little radio bullet, and then you hit the quote button, and then you put it under distribution. Now, if you wanted it quoted separately, you could come down here and pick one of these that's not assigned and put it there. Otherwise, again, I would put it with switchgear. If you want to put labor in, that's fine, or you can do it later. If you leave it checked, it's open. So I want a widget quoted with my switchgear. There's the quantity. Let's say there's 2 of them. Now, if I go back to that report one more time, all these modules have that report. So it's going to add the widget to the quote report. This one went to the second page. There's the widget and the meter. So there's how it handles the temporary items or the items that aren't part of the 6 distribution takeoff modules.